For the last part of this certain type of discussion, so please take note that the cytoskeleton is only present among eukaryotic cells because prokaryotic cells are possessing different types of materials, and they are not actually possessing here microtubules, microfilaments, and intermediate filaments for their structural integrity. Okay? So in the case of both animals and plant cells, specifically eukaryotic cells, we are possessing here different specialized types of cytoskeleton. Let's simply start with the microtubules. Microtubules are actually composed of the protein known as tubulin. Okay, as you can observe here, from the name itself, microtubules, it is possessing the protein tubulin, which is the largest type of cytoskeleton. If microtubule, it is actually the largest and at the same time the one that's responsible more on the integrity of the cell. In the case of the microfilaments, they are now the contractile part and the flexible part of the cytoskeleton. The reason why cells are possessing elasticity, it is because of the microfilaments. And lastly, in the case of the intermediate filaments, they are now responsible for the repair, and at the same time, they also aid in the strength that is present within those cells. Specifically, from the name of intermediate filaments, it is now the one that will fill up missing microfilaments or even microtubules, and they are more on responsible for the support that is present among different types of cells. Whenever they are needed, whenever a cell is damaged, the intermediate filaments will be there to assist these different types of cytoskeleton. Now, what are the different functions of this cytoskeleton? Specifically, let's start with the microtubules. Microtubules, they are responsible for the shape of the cell. Then, microtubules are also responsible for guiding the movement of organelles, and it is also responsible for separating chromosomes during cell division. You can observe here a transport protein, this one that is technically just like strutting on a runway. Okay, so this is actually an example of an actual protein. I mean, this is computer-generated illustration of what a transport protein look like. But as you can observe here, this transport protein is actually made out of different types of amino acids. Then, because of the presence of this microtubule that you can observe here at the bottom, it will now be guiding this transport protein for the movement of this vacuole or vesicle. Okay, this part is actually containing different types of materials that is present within our cells, because this is an example of a vesicle. Then the transport protein will be responsible for their movement. Then lastly, the microtubules will simply guide them on where they should go. The different organelles are not technically just floating on the cytoplasm, but rather they are still connected with the presence of this transport protein, or also known as a motor protein. It is specifically known as a dynein. Okay, this dynein protein, it is responsible now for delivering these substances, these materials, and these organelles to the different parts of the cell. From the name itself, motor protein, it is now responsible for the mobility of the different types of the materials and organelles that is present inside those cells. Other than the guiding of different organelles, once again, microtubules are responsible for the cell division, specifically among animal cells. Centrosome and centriole are specialized types of microtubules that are present among animal cells. Animal cells contain centrosomes and centrioles, and not plant cells, because plant cells are actually possessing here the cell wall, which I'm going to discuss on the next slide. Cell walls are responsible for the integrity of the cells of plants. But in the case of animal cells, since we are not possessing any cell wall, our cells are actually possessing here more on circular and irregular shape, and the centrosome and centrioles will be responsible now for guiding our chromosomes during the process of cell division. So centrosomes and centrioles, they are just the organizing center. Okay, they are just responsible for organizing the process of PMAT, either the mitosis or meiosis. So once again, we have the presence of the prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. So those processes are actually being controlled and monitored by the centrosomes and the centriole. Once again, they are only present among animal cells and not on plant cells because the cellular integrity is much better, obviously, on plant cells than on animal cells. And speaking of which, since we are talking about the presence of movement and cell integrity, we also have here the presence of cilia and flagella. Cilia, these are actually also made out of different types of microtubules. As you can observe, microtubules are very efficient type of cytoskeleton, unlike intermediate filaments and microfilaments, which is more on structure. Microtubules, they vary on different functions. Okay? They're also responsible for movement. So for instance, we have here the presence of a paramecium. A paramecium, it is now possessing cilia, are responsible for the movement that is present on this protist. While in the case of a flagella, as you can observe here, they are just like tails that are present now on sperms. Okay, these are sperms, then this is a paramecium. The movement of cilia, it is actually not a continuous wave-like, but rather they are moving on a certain type of direction that will simply either push or pull that part of the cell or of that organism. Okay? While in the case of the flagella, they are now possessing wave-like motions, just like what you can observe on sperms. Okay? Cilia and flagella are actually moving on different manners, and at the same time, their structure are not the same. Flagella, it is more on larger than the cilia. Then the cilia, it is more efficient whenever we are talking about smaller movements. Okay? And cilia, they're also present on the lining of our respiratory tract. If you can actually observe, cilia, it's not only responsible for motion but also for protection. Okay, so that's the thing about these certain types of microtubules. And lastly, we are now going to consider here the presence of the cell wall. Cell wall, it is an extracellular structure that distinguishes plant cells from animal cells. So, if I am going to ask you, what do you think would be the consequence if animal cells are possessing cell wall? Okay, so this would actually be the introductory question that I am going to ask to every single one of you regarding this discussion. What do you think would be the consequences if humans, if animals are possessing cell wall? Now, this cell wall protects the plant cell, maintains its shape, and prevents excessive uptake of water. And that is also one of the reasons why motion and mobility is not that evident when it comes to plant cells. Okay, because they are possessing here a rigid structure because of the presence of cell wall. Cell wall is made out of cellulose, and you cannot actually observe here, but there are very small holes and connections that are present between a cell wall of a plant cell to another cell wall of a plant cell. And that is a passage known as plasmodesma if it is singular, then plasmodesmata if it is plural. Plasmodesma and plasmodesmata are responsible for the intercellular junction or the junction between two plant cells. They are responsible for communication, even the conduction of different materials that are present on these certain types of cells. As you can observe here, this is the cell wall. Then you can observe also the movement of the chloroplast. Okay, that is the chloroplast that you can observe here. And at the center, even though it is not that evident, majority of the part that is actually present here in this Elodea cell. Elodea, it is actually an example of an aquatic plant that resembles Hydrilla versitillata, or they are also known as the digman, that is present on the fishing ponds. So these cells are actually possessing a very large water vacuole. For the last part of our discussion, other than the presence of different things that you should remember when it comes to those different types of cells, specifically when it comes to animal cell and plant cell, which are both eukaryotic cells, let's now consider here a cell analogy. This is actually one of our activities that we are going to accomplish for this module, which is all about cell analogy. Cell analogy, it is actually a drill that discusses the similarities in the function and role being played by the different members of the institution, different members of that scenario or organization, with cell organelles and any materials present inside the cell. So whenever we're talking about analogy, we are now comparing the similarities that are present not only on structure but also on their functions. On page number 10 of your module, there is actually an example of a cell analogy that you need to accomplish, which is all about the branches of the government. So it is now up to you if how you're actually going to compare the executive department, the legislative department, judiciary, Philippine Archipelago, then the AFP, the DILG, and even the presence of the Bureau of Customs to the different parts of the cell. So please take note when it comes to your answers here. Consider here an example which is present on the first part, 1987 Philippine Constitution. It is considered the DNA. Why? Because it is now the basis for the laws that will simply be created and should be followed by Filipinos. Just like what is present on the DNA. It is now possessing the information, the basic information that is present within every single one of us. Okay, so other example of cell analogy, other than the government, I'm going to provide you a few examples. Okay, so for instance, a restaurant. Okay, how are we going to adopt cell analogy with a restaurant? For instance, we have here the presence of Squidward, if you're aware of SpongeBob SquarePants. Squidward is a cashier. What do you think are the different cell organelles, or what do you think is the cell organelle that is analogous to the function of a cashier, just like Squidward? We can actually say that probably Squidward is an example of a secretory vesicle, for instance. Okay? Since remember, in the case of the secretory vesicle, it will hold the material. It is not responsible for the distribution of different biomolecules or modified materials to the exterior of the cell. So if we're going to consider this, the customers could be the other types of cells, then the food products, just like the Krabby Patty and the drinks, it is now the modified biomolecules. Then Squidward, as a secretory vesicle, will now give off this material. He will handle it, then it will now be given to the customers. Okay? So that is actually an analogy. Cashier as a secretory vesicle because it will now give off the biomolecules in the form of Krabby Patty or of the drinks or of the fries to the customers, which are now the other types of cells. Okay? It could also be SpongeBob SquarePants as a fry cook. As a fry cook, he is now responsible for modifying the raw ingredients, which are the patty, the lettuce, the buns, the tomato, the pickles, and even the cheese, mustard, and ketchup. So those materials are the monomers. Okay? Then, it will now be modified by SpongeBob to create now the Krabby Patty. So what do you think is now the part of the cell that is analogous to the function of SpongeBob SquarePants as a fry cook? It's analogous to the Golgi apparatus because he will now modify those food products. Okay, so you can actually see here the point, the connection when it comes to cell analogy. Okay, and lastly, on the last part, for instance, inside the classroom, if you are actually missing the physical classroom, so we have here my former advisory classroom. Okay, so I have here St. John the 23rd, since I am the advisor of St. John the 23rd for 2 consecutive years. This is my classroom. So we can observe here that the walls that are present in this classroom, it could be a form of the plasma membrane or the cell membrane because it is now protecting the barrier or it is now protecting the cell itself, which is the classroom of St. John the 23rd. Then, you can observe here that there is also the presence of the students. The students could be an example of the different biomolecules that are now present inside the cell that is needed to be modified. Modified by whom? By the teachers, because the teachers will now be the Golgi apparatus. They will modify the learning, or they will now enhance the learning and the critical thinking and even the higher order thinking skills of the students. Okay, so you can actually see my point whenever we are talking about cell analogy. Remember, we are just creating here connections based on the similarities and differences that are present on different scenarios and different characters that is present on a certain type of situation or a certain type of place. Okay, so that simply concludes my discussion for Module 4. So, Thank you and see you on our consultation periods. Paalam!